All right. Good evening. We are going to get started. So good evening. My name is Susie Plott, and I am the Community and Development Marketing Manager for Old Mission Santa Barbara. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. We are excited to continue our speaker series tonight on this important conversation around race. If you've tuned in for the last two sessions, welcome back. And if it's your first time watching, we are excited to have you here. And please make sure to check out the recordings of the first two sessions available on our website. Tonight's session is also being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel tomorrow. A few housekeeping items. A reminder that all attendees are on mute and video screens are turned off. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will be keeping an eye on it during the presentation, and we will have time at the end for a Q&A. This speaker series is being offered free, as we feel that it is an important topic for us to be talking about. However, please know that we are paying the speakers as we value the work that they are putting into their presentations and the time that they are taking to be here this evening. So if you would like to support Old Mission Santa Barbara and this speaker series, there is a donation button at the bottom of all email communications, including the email that will be sent out afterwards. I do want to clarify that this is totally optional, and we appreciate your support just by being here this evening. These presentations are meant to be the beginning of conversation around race, and for many, the first step in learning. Our speaker this evening has wonderfully put together an additional resource document with suggested additional readings if you're wanting to learn more about the topic. It will be sent out with the follow-up email after the session. I would now like to introduce Brother Mark, our guardian at Old Mission Santa Barbara, to kick us off. Unfortunately, he is muted. There we go.
How's that? Okay, we did it. Thanks everybody for joining in. My name is Brother Mark. I'm the guardian here at Old Mission Santa Barbara. And I just need to teach you one more word. So every week I try to teach you one word that's a Franciscan value, and the word is dignity. Dignity. And in contemplating that, I wondered in my own life where I really learned what dignity really meant was when I worked in prisons. So I have a degree in criminology, and I worked in with juveniles as a chaplain, and I've been in two death rows visiting people and other prisons visiting. What has really hit me is learning that each person I met, no matter what the crime was, they have dignity. That's a challenge right now, I think, in our country and in the world. Is it's so easy to point fingers at somebody, and somehow we can say they have less dignity, and therefore I can oppress them. So our friend Jesus is our basis for teaching us that every human being has dignity, and it's the same, equal dignity. So pay attention to that, please, as we go through our presentation today. I'm excited that we're going to look at the past, and therefore we're going to help us to realize what's going on in the year 2020. And of course, after this series at the mission, we're going to say, where do we go from here? So I'd like to introduce our presenter, Miroslava Chavez-Garcia. She's a professor in the Department of History at UC Santa Barbara, and somehow she also holds affiliate status in two other departments at UCSB, so Departments of Chicano Studies and Feminist Studies. She's an author of a few books. I just want to tell you the names of a couple. So one is Negotiating Conquest, Gender and Power in California from the 1770s to the 1880s. Another book she wrote is States of Delinquency, Race and Science in the Making of California's Juvenile Justice System. And her most recent book is titled Migrant Longing, letter writing across the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. And it's a history of transnational migration and gender, courtship, and identity, as told through more than 300 personal letters exchanged across the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. So, as I've said at the first two, and I'm going to say it today, we are presenting someone who's going to speak the truth. And in that truth, then we can deepen how we treat one another with dignity. So I turn it over to Miroslava.
Thank you so much for those words. I really appreciate it. And it's nice to reflect on that word, dignity, for sure. Thank you to the mission for inviting me to participate. I'm to Monica Orozco, to Susie Plott, who have been so helpful and instrumental in getting and organizing all of this. So we are, as we all, most of us are probably locals. We know it's a little warm, so I'm trying to stay and look cool as much as possible. The fan right above my head is helping a little bit. So I'll go ahead and get started. So let me. Cool. I'm going to share the screen, and which I've done. Okay. So here's my talk. The title of my talk today is "Don't Kill Me, Sister: Race, Gender, and Justice in Mexican California." 19th century Mexican Los Angeles was a cosmopolitan town. Though many visitors and writers alike have described it as a small, dusty pueblo with no more than 2,500 residents in the 1840s, Los Angeles was home to many newcomers from other parts of the Mexican North, as well as from the globe, including Peru, Great Britain, and France. The old Spanish Trail, linking New Mexico to California, enabled scores of New Mexican families to settle in the region. Not everyone, adults and children alike, who arrived from New Mexico, however, adjusted smoothly to the new community, including Guadalupe Trujillo, a Spanish-Mexican woman from New Mexico. Trujillo offended local sensibilities when she murdered her Indian servant, a female named Ysabel, with no known last name, for what Trujillo reported as insolence. So again, Ysabel doesn't, no last name appears in the records for her. Local Angelinos did not take the matter of criminal justice lightly. Rather, they put Trujillo on trial and imprisoned her, though it appears she eventually spent little time in jail. Today, my talk examines in greater detail the murder and the controversy over the nature of Trujillo's relations with Ysabel and the larger questions they raised about the meanings of gender, race, and justice in Mexican California. On February 15, 1843, the Justice of the Peace in Los Angeles learned that about 11 in the morning, Guadalupe Trujillo had stabbed her Indian servant Ysabel in the throat, leading to her death. The incident took place in a room they rented at Mission San Gabriel, situated about 15 miles from the town. By then, the mission had been secularized and much of the land dispersed in 1843. The Justice of the Peace then informed the judge, Manuel Dominguez, of the incident. Upon hearing the news, the judge and a doctor set out for the mission to investigate the killing. When they arrived, they found Ysabel's lifeless body on the floor, covered by a blanket. They removed the blanket and saw the severity of the wound that Trujillo had inflicted. The doctor then measured the laceration, informing the judge that it was 8 centimeters in length and 2 centimeters deep, and was flanked by multiple smaller lacerations. Ysabel's artery, he determined, had been severed. Given the condition of Ysabel's body, the doctor concluded that the perpetrator had used repetition and force. So again, there's a cut and a wound with little nicks around it. That's what they saw. Following the initial investigation, the judge ordered a trial to determine if Trujillo had killed Ysabel in self-defense, as she alleged in the court appearance before him, or if she had in fact premeditated a murder. Under Mexican law, capital crimes against Indians were punishable by imprisonment. Indians also had the right to bring charges and testify against non-Indians. Throughout the trial, the prosecution, as well as other witnesses, challenged Trujillo's assertions of self-defense, with the prosecution arguing that Trujillo and not Ysabel had instigated the fight. Trujillo, the prosecution contended, had grown tired of Ysabel's insolence and finally committed premeditated murder. Ultimately, the responsibility of weighing the evidence in the case and determining its outcome, and in particular Trujillo's future, rested on the judge's shoulders alone, for in the Mexican court systems, juries were not used at the local level. So it was the judge deciding all of this. Trujillo's crime, while extreme, was not an aberration in the community. The Los Angeles court records from which this case is taken, and I want to show you a sample of these records. And so here's a sample of a different record, a different case. As you can see, original handwritten Spanish language records from the 1830s and 1840s. That's one page, and this is another page from the exact same, this case. Not the one that we're talking about right now, but this other case. So a little difficult to read, but over time, you get used to it, the writing. So these alcalde court records, these cases reveal that Mexican women like Trujillo perpetrated crimes against members of their community. These crimes included the self-identified gente de razón, literally people of reason. So here I'm talking about the nature of these crimes and who it involved. And for that, I want to show you, just go over quickly some of these terms of identity that I'll be using today. So the different groups, the social classes that were involved in these records and in the town of Los Angeles were the gente de razón, which means literally people of reason, as well as their cultural and racial other California Indians. Now, if we break these down, there's the group identified as neofitos, neophytes, or the baptized Christian Indians, as well as what they called gentiles, unbaptized non-Christian natives. The court records also show that Mexicans who perpetrated such crimes were regularly prosecuted for their excesses. These cases indicate as well that contentious social and family relations existed among women of different socioeconomic, cultural, and racial groups. Women from landowning families, or those whose husbands were prominent political leaders, had links to the power structure that their impoverished counterparts did not. Moreover, Mexican women, generally as gente de razón, had access to economic, political, and social power that indigenous women in California rarely achieved. Native women's entrance into the Spanish cultural world, in which they learned to speak the Spanish language, worship in the Catholic faith, and follow Spanish cultural and gender prescriptions, did not ordinarily lead Mexican and Indian women to forge ties of sisterhood across cultural and socioeconomic lines. Rather, they often remained on opposite sides of the cultural divides. Hierarchical and unequal relations between Indians and Mexicans, regardless of gender or social class, date to the founding of Los Angeles in 1781. Though the population of the pueblo came originally from the lower strata of Spanish-Mexican society and had racially mixed backgrounds of Native, African, and Spanish ancestry, the settlers and their descendants distinguished themselves culturally and later ethnically from the gentiles who were residing in the villages and neofitos living at the missions. I just wanted to show you really quickly here. One of the censuses is taken from Los Angeles, the Padrón, and this will show you the diversity of the founders. This is officially, or maybe unofficially, the second census. So Los Angeles founded in 1781. And in this, I've taken this census from Bill Mason's work, William Mason, on the census of Los Angeles to show how people lightened or whitened themselves over time. Their categories will change in the censuses. So it's kind of identity and race and culture are really quite difficult to get at, but you can see it in motion in these censuses. That identity of gente de razón also forged a cultural and social bond among them, as increasingly over time they downplayed and forgot their own mixed heritage and saw themselves as Californios. They also distanced themselves socially from Indians, males and females, gentiles and neofitos, by relying on them almost exclusively as laborers in the pueblo, ranchos, and at nearby Mission San Gabriel. The pobladores, or the civilian settlers, hired Gabrieleño men, women, and children from nearby villages, and later gentiles from other rancherias, as well as neofitos from the local mission, not only for public projects, but also for plowing, planting, harvesting, and tending to livestock. In return, pobladores paid them and their village chiefs or the mission friars in kind, usually in foodstuffs, blankets, small trinkets, or hides. Later, residents turned to locally brewed alcohol, or what they called aguardiente, as compensation, a practice, though outlawed in 1812, that led to drunkenness, violence, and imprisonment, and other adverse social consequences for Native Californians. Following secularization in the 1830s, when neophytes left the missions, several hundred drifted into the pueblo and ranchos, replacing the gentiles as the main source of labor. When the economy failed to accommodate the oversupply of workers, who then became a nuisance to the gente de razón, the city leaders enacted vagrancy ordinances in the late 1830s and 1840s. those Indians unable to pay fines found themselves performing forced labor on public works or auctioned off to the highest bidders. The result was often slavery in all but name. The social and cultural position of Indians in relation to the gente de razón in Los Angeles provides a context in which to analyze the murder trial of Guadalupe Trujillo and examine how relations of power based on gender, social status, cultural and racial identity structured and inform social and family relations between Trujillo and Ysabel. Only recently have scholars begun to probe the complex interactions between Mexicans and natives, men and women, in California. These studies demonstrate that violence, including rape, labor, fictive kinship links, which were created through marriage and baptism, family ties, and reciprocity, shaped and characterized bonds between Mexican and Native peoples across social classes. In other words, there was a lot of social relations shaped by many of these church-related rituals and so forth. Though significant to our understanding of Mexican-Indian relations, these studies have largely ignored how the legal system, law and justice in the community, handled cross-cultural relationships that turned sour and ultimately led to deadly consequences. The documentation available for this trial also allows us to examine the subtleties and the details of the incident surrounding Ysabel's death, providing an opportunity to understand how and why her relationship with Trujillo had become strained and led to violence. The testimony discloses that their long-time relationship was tolerant at best and hostile at worst. As we will see, the judge was ultimately responsible for determining if Trujillo, as Ysabel's master and social better, had abused her power over the indigenous woman. The evidence will also enable us to explore closely the immediate circumstances that caused the women to see each other as adversaries and that drove Trujillo to kill Ysabel. It will also allow us to explore not only how Angelenos dealt with crime, but also how the local court viewed Trujillo, how the local court had viewed Trujillo and Ysabel's relations and their larger roles in society. Everyone agreed that Trujillo had committed a crime when she killed Ysabel, but disagreed as to the reason and for the severity of the crime. The arguments that the defense and the prosecution presented while in opposition disclosed that both sides attempted to prove the victimization of their respective clients by invoking their cultural identities and social ranks and by drawing on gente de razón values that ascribe the role of master to Mexicans and servants to Indians. Trujillo, most residents agreed, was Ysabel's social better. But as the judge's rulings would demonstrate, Trujillo's socioeconomic status and cultural identity did not bar her from the community standards of law and justice. The testimony of key witnesses, the counsel's arguments, and the judge's decision will provide us with clues as to the ways in which the local community viewed cross-cultural social relations between Mexican and Native American women at the center of this event. Now let's go back to the trail again. Guadalupe Trujillo, the woman at the center of this controversy and the trial, was not a native of Los Angeles or California, as I've mentioned earlier. She and her family, which included a husband, a young daughter, and their servant, Ysabel, had originally migrated from their hometown of Abiquiu, New Mexico, to the San Gabriel region sometime after 1839. Their relocation was part of a larger trend of migration from New Mexico to California, fueled initially, that is in the 1830s, by Euro-American traders who went in search of new markets, goods, and livestock. Those traders were soon followed by families from New Mexico, who removed themselves permanently to California. In Abiquiu, a small town of no more than 2,000 inhabitants, Trujillo and her family belonged to the lower middling class, as they were neither members of the nobility nor genizaros, or detribalized Indians, as was Ysabel. So she actually was a genizara. When they arrived in Los Angeles, the family had little economic means with which to acquire or maintain their property, maintain or own any property, forcing them to rent a room at the mission. And the father to work as a laborer, for local proprietors. So the father of the head of the family was a local laborer, and they were renting a room at the mission. Ysabel, in turn, held a lowly and subordinate position as a servant and an orphan Navajo who had arrived in Trujillo's largely mestizo household at infancy. Her lack of a surname and of a genealogical tie to others in the community indicates that she was not only a criada, or a servant, but also a genizara. In New Mexico, genizaros were captured Indians, most often Navajo and Apache, whom Spanish traders sold or exchanged for payments in cash or in kind. As spoils of wars and as captives, they were pressed into domestic service at a young age, as was Ysabel. In a society that marked captured slaves and the vanquished as dishonored and disgraced, Ysabel, like other genizaros, represented a group of individuals who were viewed as intruders and outsiders to the community. Genizaros occupied the lowest social rank and were forced to perform, quote unquote, perform the community's most menial and degrading tasks, according to historian Ramon Gutierrez. After Trujillo and her household migrated to Mexican California, Ysabel's role as a servant and a slave who lacked honor, status, or privileges remained intact. Despite the fact that officials in colonial Mexico had outlawed slavery, New Mexicans and Angelinos allowed this practice to continue by using captured Indians as domestics and laborers, among other roles in the community. In the San Gabriel, Los Angeles region, Yuma children and young women taken from the Colorado River region were regularly brought to town and put to labor in the homes and the ranchos of local residents. In Ysabel's case, she was, for all intents and purposes, a slave until her death, though the court transcriptions fail to disclose the reality of her perpetual servitude. How and why her social and family relations with Trujillo turned bitter and culminated in her death is an issue that the court sought to resolve. Guadalupe Trujillo's murder trial opened with the testimony of Juan Perez. He was the manager at the mission. Perez recalled that on the 15th of February, 1843, after he had returned from his early morning duties, he saw Trujillo with her young daughter in the kitchen and proceeded to his room. So he went on his own business. Soon after, he said, an Indian child came to him saying, "She's calling you." She's calling you, she repeated. The child repeated. "Who is calling me?" he asked. The child said, "Ysabel." He turned, and at that moment, he saw Ysabel on the floor, seriously injured, and went to her aid. "What have you done?" he turned to ask Trujillo, who was nearby. "Ysabel has insulted me on numerous occasions, and this time I could no longer contain myself," Trujillo responded. "Couldn't you have used a stick and punished her that way?" Perez asked. "I called to Ysabel," she answered, and told her to go and wash the clothes, as she had yet to complete her chores. Ysabel, who was outside, Trujillo told Perez, refused. So I pushed her inside. She then grabbed my rebozo and shirt and tore them. Once inside, I asked Ysabel, "Why do you refuse to do what I say? Since you haven't cooked the meal, why don't you go and complete the wash?" In defiance, this is Trujillo telling Perez, who's telling the court, in defiance, Ysabel declared, I don't want to be with you any longer. I want to go wherever I wish." And Ysabel says, "Why is it that the Indian women of the mission work less than I do, and they have fine skirts made of indianilla, and indianilla is a fine cloth?" Ysabel's comments, as noted by Trujillo, reveal that the servant believed her master doled out unfair treatment, as compared to other women at Mission San Gabriel, who seemingly enjoyed more freedoms. I must say that there's actually pause here, that there are very few references to the local indigenous population and what they were doing, since the focus is on Ysabel, who is from New Mexico. So it's interesting to see how another set of relationships that were cultivated in New Mexico now are being sort of placed in Los Angeles. Let's see, okay. At that instant, Trujillo continued. Perez is still telling the story as told to him from Trujillo. Ysabel grabbed a large kitchen knife. "What are you going to do with that knife?" demanded Trujillo. "You'll see," Ysabel responded. As Ysabel approached Trujillo with the knife, Trujillo took advantage of an opportunity to wrestle the weapon from her. Ysabel then grabbed Trujillo by the hair. In an attempt to force Ysabel to loosen her hold, Trujillo put the knife at her throat, but when that move failed, Trujillo believed she had no other option than to stab Ysabel. The manager's narrative, based on what Trujillo had recounted to him, supported Trujillo's claim that she had killed Ysabel in self-defense. Understandably, his testimony painted a picture of Ysabel as the aggressive and unmindful Indian servant who launched a surprise attack on the unsuspecting Trujillo, who had no choice but to defend herself. It gets better. Bernardo Girado, a worker at the mission, so Girado is his last name, he also testified about what he saw and heard following Ysabel's murder. Of all the testimonies in the trial, his proved most damaging to Trujillo's claim of self-defense. The employee of the mission told the court what he had witnessed firsthand. He stated that on the 15th of February, he had arrived at the mission at about 11 in the morning in the company of the priest. As they entered, they saw Ysabel on the floor, lifeless. At that moment, he saw the manager of the mission, Juan Perez, who was our first witness. He saw him enter the room. Jurado heard him declare that Trujillo was responsible for Ysabel's murder. Guadalupe Trujillo then responded, "It has been done. If I didn't defend myself, the India would have killed me. At the time she launched her surprise attack against me, she had a knife in hand, but I managed to take hold of it and remove it from her grasp." Jurado then informed the judge about the details he knew of the incident as he had learned them secondhand. Actually, in the Mexican court system and the Spanish civil law, hearsay was acceptable forms of testimony, which makes it really great to hear about what other people are saying. So hearsay is allowable. Francisco Villa, who was another field worker at the mission, told Jurado about a rumor concerning Ysabel's death. Villa, in turn, had heard this rumor as it circulated among Indian workers at the mission. So the native workers of the mission were talking about this murder. According to the rumor, the fight had begun when Ysabel slandered Trujillo's honor. Slurs against one's honor, observes New Mexico historian Ramon Gutierrez, constituted the fiercest fighting words that could be uttered. The native peoples also claimed, that stated Villa, that during the fight, Trujillo had used her body to pin Ysabel to the floor and used her knee to hold Ysabel down while she called to her young daughter to bring her a knife from the kitchen cupboard. Jurado continued his testimony by recounting what another field worker had informed him about the assault. So lots of voices getting involved here. While standing near an open window at the mission, where Lopez, with this other witness, he had stood to light a cigarette, he told Jurado that he had heard Ysabel exclaim in fear, "No me mates, hermana Guadalupe." In other words, "Don't kill me, sister Guadalupe," right? So that's what he heard. As he turned to see the source of this cry, he witnessed Trujillo stabbing her in the neck, stabbing Ysabel. "What are you doing?" this witness yelled to Trujillo, allegedly. "Go to hell," she retorted. This is Trujillo telling him to go to hell. Lopez, this witness, told Jurado that the scene had startled him, that he left the two women. Apparently, he was unwilling to intervene in the scuffle or assist the victim, which doesn't make him look all that great. Jurado's testimony indicates that Ysabel's insolence had provoked the fight, thus refuting the idea that Trujillo had premeditated the murder. However, the hearsay evidence he presented on behalf of the Indians not only placed blame on Trujillo for Ysabel's death, but also suggested that Trujillo had callously murdered Ysabel, adding credence to the prosecution's contention that Trujillo had used more than self-defense measures in killing Ysabel. In other words, again, Trujillo had calculated the murder. In addition to the manager and the field worker's testimony, Tiburcio Lopez and Francisco Villa furnished their own accounts to the court. So these are some of the same witnesses coming forward again. Lopez supported Jurado's story that he had heard sounds of a fight coming through an open window of the mission. However, he did not say he heard Ysabel cry, "Don't kill me, sister Guadalupe." Instead, he claimed to hear Trujillo yell, "Is there not a Christian of God to defend me?" Francisco Villa's statements before the judge also raised doubts about Jurado's testimony. Villa denied hearing or knowing anything about the incident. He admitted hearing talk among the Indians, but as he told the judge, he had no interest in the conversations. He only knew that Ysabel had died. So there's lots of conflicting statements going on here. Some saying that, suggesting that she had premeditated, others saying it was in self-defense. To me, it was interesting that all these voices were at play here. Okay, so one other witness comes forward. Lastly, we have somebody named Antonio Arce. He's a transient from Loreto, Baja California. So we have people from Baja California in Los Angeles. He testified. He says, about 11 in the morning, he stated, "I went out to light a cigarette with the flame coming from a fire in front of Trujillo's home. At that moment," he continued, "I saw Trujillo come out looking devastated and said to me, 'What do you say, Don Antonio, about what has happened to me with this India?' Arce asked her to explain herself. 'Look for yourself,' she says, 'look for yourself.' She repeated, and then she asked him to find the priest. Arce said that he then noticed blood on her hand and calculated that a tragedy or a desgracia had occurred. He immediately went to get the priest, and at that moment, the padre arrived with Jurado. Arce's testimony, while insightful, provided no further clues as to the motives behind the murder. The lack of an eyewitness, other than Trujillo, only worked to muddle the facts surrounding the case. At the behest of Guadalupe Trujillo's husband, his last name was Quintana. Maybe I'll stop mentioning all these names. So Trujillo's husband's name is Quintana, his last name, and two former New Mexicans, a fellow named Chacon and Garcia. So all these three people come forward, testifying that Ysabel had lived a scandalous life in New Mexico. So they're here to sort of degrade her character, right? Ysabel, who has died. Quintana wanted the men to tell the court of an infanticide that Ysabel had committed in New Mexico so as to characterize her as an Indian woman of depraved habits, and as a mother inclined to commit the unspeakable crime of killing her own child to remind the court of her lowly social position. When the court interrogated the two men, they confirmed Quintana's allegations. And remember, Quintana is Trujillo's husband. Quintana also had another witness, Juan Perez, right, the manager at the mission, informed the court that he knew that of Ysabel's covert plan to leave the household. So Juan Perez alleged that Ysabel was going to escape from this household or leave. He too affirmed the story for the judge. Another witness confirmed the assertion that Ysabel had been seduced by another man who had plotted to take her from the mission. So the story goes even deeper, right? She not only planned to leave on her own, but she had been seduced by somebody and was going to lure her away. Clearly, Quintana's ploy was to tarnish Ysabel's maternal instincts, her humanity and loyalty, cultural traits that the court and the gente de razón expected a woman and a servant to have. The New Mexican's testimony gave Trujillo's defense more ammunition from which to draw in the portrayal of Ysabel as the aggressive Indian servant who had stepped out of line when she challenged Trujillo's orders. Finally, Guadalupe Trujillo, the only witness, testified on her own behalf. She claimed that Ysabel had become quite quarrelsome during the past few months. Her latest transgression had been her refusal to complete her domestic chores and her announcement, this is according to Trujillo, "I am leaving the household." In response, Trujillo informed the court that she had told Ysabel, "You are not free to go anywhere because I have raised you since you were a child." "I am too free," Ysabel countered. With no other alternative, Trujillo used physical force to get Ysabel to obey. Alarmed, Trujillo asked, "What are you doing with that knife?" Excuse me, let me back up. Ysabel countered, with no other alternative, Trujillo went into the kitchen. Trujillo used physical force to get Ysabel to obey. Ysabel responded by grabbing a knife from the kitchen and threatened to use it. So Trujillo saying now it was Ysabel who grabbed the knife. Alarmed, Trujillo asked Ysabel, "What are you doing with that knife?" "You'll see," Ysabel responded, according to Trujillo. Trujillo tried to take the knife away, she confessed to the court. And in the ensuing struggle, the knife lodged itself in Ysabel's body. Trujillo called to her young daughter to find help. Trujillo told the judge she could not remember the details of the incident because she had become quite upset at what had transpired. In her testimony, Trujillo sought to dispel any notion that her relationship with Ysabel had been stormy until the incident itself. She described their relations in language that drew upon a discourse of sisterhood and family unity. She said, "I have always seen Ysabel as a sister," she told the judge, "and I feel deeply for what I did. She was my father's orphan, and he gave her to me so that we would recognize each other as sisters." The judge expressed skepticism. "What do you have to say about causing the death of a woman whom you considered as a sister?" he asked. "I killed her in defensa propia, in self-defense, and without prior thought," she replied. "How is it you killed her in self-defense? You took the knife away from the deceased, and so wasn't the death unnecessary?" "I took the knife away from her with the intent to throw it away, but I struck her, and I don't know how," Trujillo explained. "How do you not know how you struck her? The wound was such that it was done intentionally." Trujillo tried to explain that Ysabel had her by the hair and she could not see what was happening. The judge was not convinced and persisted with his line of questioning. "What do you have to say about using an illegal weapon in the act?" he asked. "I didn't have it in the first place. The one who used it was Ysabel. I took it from her to throw it away," she responded. "Did you knowingly provoke the situation when you pushed Ysabel?" "I didn't provoke her," Trujillo said. "What I wanted to do was to get her inside in order to reprimand her in another way," she explained. "If you wanted to correct her in another way, why not wait for your husband to do so? He could have used more prudence," the judge said. I intended to correct Ysabel as a mother does to a daughter," explained Trujillo. While Trujillo had previously informed the court that she had always seen Ysabel as a sister, quote unquote, implying equality in the relationship, now she characterized their relations as hierarchical and unequal. Trujillo's testimony of their social relations makes it unclear how they saw the roles in the household and the larger community. Did they see each other as sisters, as Trujillo testified, or did they perceive their arrangement as a parent-child relationship? While the case breakers failed to indicate how they viewed each other, the evidence in the context of the relationship reveals that their relations were anything but equal. The judge's interrogation of Trujillo's motives and actions suggests that he considered it improper for her to take the initiative to reprimand Ysabel. Customarily, the head of the household, that is the patriarch, held the power to govern and to correct members of the family, including household servants, when they stepped out of line. So it would have been the husband, Quintana, was the one who should have reprimanded her. In the judge's view, Trujillo had not only violated her role as a master, but also her gender role in the family and the community. In other words, she had temporarily usurped her husband's position of the family head, and she had abused that power. With the conclusion of the testimony, the prosecution, representing the people of Mexican California, headed by Jose del Carmen Lugo, and the defense, headed by Vicente Sanchez, who are characters I see a lot in these records, right? So you might not be familiar with them, but Lugo and Sanchez. They presented their arguments. The prosecutor, Lugo, began by boldly asserting that on the 15th of February, Doña Guadalupe Trujillo committed a scandalous murder of the unfortunate Indian woman from New Mexico, named Ysabel. It is true, he acknowledged, that no witnesses appeared to justify the antecedents of such an attempt, but we must determine what occurred from those who manifest their declarations. The prisoner, he continued, attempts to evade her crime frivolously, despite the existence of a notable contradiction in the acts. Certainly, she who uses vengeance does not do it without forethought, but with premeditation. Persuasive evidence exists, he expressed, of Trujillo's deceit and disdain of Ysabel, to prove that Trujillo had a motive to kill Ysabel, and did so at the moment when no one was present. The plea of self-defense, he concluded, was implausible. For her crime, he asked that the court sentence her to 2 years of harsh imprisonment. The defense attorney, Sanchez, responded to the prosecutor by arguing that Ysabel had attacked Trujillo with ferocity, so it was Ysabel. Trujillo had merely defended herself, he declared, as is natural with any living being. Trujillo had not committed a scandalous crime, he said, but a simple homicide, done without prior thought. The defense reminded the court of testimony of one of the witnesses, Tiburcio Lopez, in which he heard Trujillo exclaim, bringing up this testimony, he says, to exclaim, "Is there not a Christian of God to save me?" So this is what Trujillo allegedly said. A declaration demonstrating that Trujillo had no choice but to defend herself. He also recalled for the court the word impensadamente. So this is the word that is used in the testimony, impensadamente, which means deeds that were done without meditation, which is a term that Trujillo had used to describe how she had killed Ysabel. So in the testimony, in the written testimony, she says, "I had done it without prior meditation." The defense concluded by emphasizing the obvious, that Trujillo was a woman of honor and family, a member of the gente de razón in the community. He did not have to remind anyone that Ysabel, as an Indian, was not among the gente de razón. To be Indian, or more precisely, a genízara, a domestic servant pressed into service, was to be without honor, family, and power. In his rebuttal, the prosecutor directly challenged the defense's attempt, he said, to excuse the severity of Trujillo's crime with the statement that she's an honorable woman with family. To argue that she did not commit a crime because of her position in the community, he said, insults the public. Implicitly, Lugo, the prosecutor, reminded the court that no member of the community, regardless of his or her social class, ethnicity, or gender, was above the law and justice. The judge agreed, ruling that Trujillo deserved a lengthier sentence than suggested by the prosecution. On the 1st of June, 1843, several months later, after weighing the evidence, the judge issued the following judgment. The judge says, in the criminal case against Guadalupe Trujillo, I sentence Trujillo to 3 years in the Presidio of Sonoma in Northern California, or where the superior tribunal shall determine. While the judge ruled that Trujillo was at fault for killing Ysabel, He did not state whether he believed Trujillo had killed Ysabel in self-defense or had premeditated the murder. So he didn't make any ruling on whether he thought it was either way. Nevertheless, his decision to punish Trujillo to a sparsely populated and remote presidio northeast of Monterrey reveals that he did not tolerate Trujillo's actions. The sentence of banishment, which a contemporary noted was a sentence equal to death, served as a warning to Gente de Razón, who was contemplating taking such measures against their Indian servants. The judge's decision then passed to the Superior Tribunal of Monterrey, an appellate body made up of 3 members who reviewed capital cases tried in the local courts throughout Mexican California. So after the judge rules, the case then goes up to the Superior Tribunal in Monterrey, and there's a 3-member panel who reviews these cases. This tribunal agreed with Los Angeles' local court that Trujillo had committed a crime, but disagreed with the sentence that had been given. They wrote, "It has been proven that Guadalupe Trujillo killed her criada, her servant, and for such an act deserves punishment. But as the punishment should fit the crime, and as the crime Trujillo committed was a homicide done in self-defense, we revoke the sentence of 3 years of seclusion." Instead of sentencing Trujillo to Sonoma for 3 years, the tribunal ordered her to the port of San Diego for 1 year, allowing her to remain in the pueblo and in proximity to her family in the San Gabriel, Los Angeles region. While it did not completely excuse her actions, the tribunal officially recognized that Ysabel had instigated the fight and that Trujillo had defended herself. The tribunal's decision also reveals that it did not share the Los Angeles court views about Mexican and Indian women's social and family relations. While the local judge believed that Trujillo's transgressions of acceptable master-servant standards of behavior deserved 3 years of banishment, the tribunal believed otherwise. In the tribunal's view, killing an Indian servant who had attacked a woman of their razón did not merit such punishment. Nor did the tribunal see the malevolence in Trujillo's actions that was detected by the local court. Put simply, the tribunal overruled the local judge's findings and undermined his attempt to carry out justice as he interpreted and applied that concept. The local court standards were further undermined when Guadalupe Trujillo was set free and allowed to return to Los Angeles less than a year after the tribunal's sentence. So when I went to go look for her in the censuses, I actually found her back in LA in 1844. So by the middle of 1844, she was living with her husband, Quintana, and her daughter, Maria, within the limits of the pueblo. This is in Los Angeles. Apparently, the murder trial and conviction did little harm to their social mobility in the pueblo. Within a half a dozen years, in 1850, the Trujillo-Quintana family had managed to acquire farming land valued at 2,000 pesos. So it was somewhat valuable land that they had. Likely they had become self-sufficient farmers. Trujillo's daughter, Maria, now 17, had also obtained her own level of social status. She had married a local farmer from New Mexico who owned land, though only worth about half as much as what their family had. So she had married. Thus, the family had managed to walk away from the incident relatively unharmed and rebuild their lives, while Ysabel had essentially been forgotten. The murder trial of Guadalupe Trujillo provides an opportunity to explore an instance where social and family relations between Mexicans and Indians became strained, and to examine the court's institutional role in the conflict in the larger cultural context. As we have seen, Trujillo's and Ysabel's social relations reflected a hierarchical and unequal distribution of power among women in the community. Despite commonalities of gender and patriarchal oppression, differences of socioeconomic status, and cultural and racial identity, these things relegated Ysabel, the Indian servant and slave, to labor for Trujillo. Indeed, as Trujillo's and Ysabel's soured relations indicate, women's material reality and cultural and racial identity drew a sharp distinction between Mexican and Native American women in the 19th century. Indian women labored for the gente de razón, and even while the latter considered domestic servants as part of the larger household, did not have the same privileges that their social betters enjoyed. The court case made these adversarial roles and relations clear. The murder trial also reveals that Mexicans, men or women, regardless of social class, were not above the law when their adversaries involved Indian servants. In this case, the court's purpose was clear: to enforce the law and impart justice in the community in spite of social, class, cultural, or racial considerations. Notwithstanding the local court's conflict with the appellate body, and ultimately Trujillo's relatively light sentence, the Los Angeles judge's ruling served as a warning to all that such actions as Trujillo's would not be tolerated. To what extent the outcome of this case impacted social relations in Mexican Los Angeles is unknown, but what is known is that Mexican and Indian women's relationships were ambiguous, they were contested, and sometimes violent. So that is my presentation. Thank you. Maybe I'll stop short.
Yes. Yeah, why don't you? All right. So we have 2 questions that have come in. So we'll start the Q&A section, but if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box and I will read them off. So our first question first starts with a statement that says, "Thank you for your honest presentation." And it says, "I have Spanish and Native American ancestry. Unfortunately, my family was not proud of our indigenous roots, and I have no information about this heritage. Do you have a suggestion, or is there ways for me to research this side of my family?"
Sure, yes. I would first, there are lots of ways. It just depends on what kind of information you have to begin with. So if you know what region your family's from, that might be a really useful way to begin to look at. What people tend to look at a lot are church records that you can access, and actually you can access them at I did a lot of my research for this book at the LDS, Latter-day Saints. They have microfilm. Actually, it's all online. What am I saying? I'm dating myself. Oh my God. It's on ancestry.com. I think a lot of this is now online, right? A lot of these records now are online, whereas in the past, I'd have to go. Microfilm is something, you can go and look at. But a lot of it, ancestry.com is a really good place to begin. Again, if you have any data that you have to begin with, would be useful, like region, maybe even some general dates. Do you know if they were married or baptized anywhere? That might help. So at least start to zoom in and looking through dates and potential ways that names were written. That's always important. But yeah, I'm trying to look at from that problem.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
there's always a way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. The next question is, do you have a sense of how representative this particular case is for the relations between Mexicans and Indians in California during that time, and if it changed kind of post that?
What's interesting about this case, this is one thing that I've kind of always struggled with. And again, because its relationships were a little bit different for the ones that were cultivated in New Mexico, as I suggested, than the ones in Los Angeles, in terms of there being really clear, deep history of this slave status of the Genizaros, right? This group has been around for a long time. They're still descendants today. But in New Mexico, they have a particular kind of history. In Los Angeles, slavery, as it was defined in Mexico, was not as clear cut, right? It happened. They were called other things. There was euphemisms, right? They were treated. But, and so there's always that question. And I think that one thing that kind of that kind of gives you an idea that there's something different going on here is when Ysabel had been complaining to Guadalupe, saying, like, how come the women here at the mission are treated so much better than I am? So what's that about? So that leads you to believe she's seeing a difference there, that perhaps she didn't have as much freedom as the other women did. And so that's what she was sort of, bringing to her attention. These court cases, the records are, there's 9 volumes of these. This is like, I spent so much time looking at these, I'll call them court records. I just love them. 9 volumes of handwritten Spanish language original court cases. And the majority of them deal with Native peoples in the Los Angeles region. And even as far as Santa Barbara, far south of San Diego, there's people from Baja California. So in terms of, there's a lot, mostly the Native peoples who appear there do appear as victims primarily. And so that's what you see, but not a lot of Native women appear. Only if they do, they appear as victims primarily. But this is kind of somewhat of a unique case, I would say. But I don't know how to extrapolate that to the larger population. I think that sometimes becomes a little more challenging. So,
thank you. And I think what also makes this particular case very interesting is that, gender is at play as well. And so you have two women. Are you able to speak to what the role of, gender kind of was, if it had been Trujillo's husband instead who had committed the crime, is there evidence of that it would not have gone to court or would not have, or would have played out differently? I'm kind of curious of that.
Yeah. There was actually a case I'm remembering right now where there was a young Mexican man, he was a boy, young man. I think he came from somewhat of a prominent family. Nevertheless, he had been with an Indian woman who the suggestions were that he had paid her for her services. But nevertheless, he had her on his horse. He knocked her down. She was injured, and she eventually died from her injuries. And they reprimanded him, but not so much for like injuring the woman, but because he defied his father. So it was about patriarchy, right? Like making sure the family power structure would remain intact. So yeah, definitely there were victims. Lots of layers. Ooh, more questions. I love questions.
Yes, there's lots of questions. Do you have a sense of how many court cases involved violence between Mexican and Indians? I know you referenced that there's quite a few others that you have documents for.
Between Mexicans and Indians, I don't know. When I used this for my book, I used like 20% of the cases, which were all involved women in some way or another. So gender was involved. 80% of the cases are about roughly involved Native peoples. But of those, I don't know. That's a good question. I have another case, the one I showed you, which is the murder of Nicholas Fink, of this a German immigrant to Los Angeles. He's killed in his shop, and it's like 400 pages, 500. It's a huge case. Still trying to find a student who wants to read Spanish. So anybody out there, you can sign up. Yeah.
No, it's great.
That's a good question.
There's a question here that asks, can you define generoso? Am I butchering that?
That's okay. No, that's okay. Yeah. No. Can I define genicero? So genicero, that's a term that's given to, we have somebody on our campus at UCSB, I think actually he's finished, a postdoctoral fellow, who was a genicero. He identifies that, and he's writing, he has a dissertation, and he's working on a book. And I'm blanking on his name right now, but I think it's Gonzalez is his last name. Nevertheless, so geniceros were essentially known as slaves. So they were detribalized Indians who were normally taken as captives during war. So usually they were Apache or Navajo then who were brought into among the Pueblo because there was warring going on among these tribes. So they would then take these as captives during wars and bring them back, and then somehow include them and adopt them into the families. They became servants. They were parts, as far as I know, they were members of the family to some extent, but on the other hand, they were clearly not, because they were given a different kind of identity. And over time, these communities, Genicero communities, formed in themselves. And so they still see themselves sort of as a separate group to some extent. I don't know the full details, but definitely in this case, that's her identity, right? So that helped me. So it was interesting to see the cosmopolitan nature of Los Angeles, how it was at that time. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So we have another question here that says, very little was said about Senor Trujillo's, I'm guessing her husband's, presence in the court or after the trial. Was it unusual for married women to have to face such charges on their own, separate from their husbands? And could women bring their own lawsuits, or were they subject to their husband's legal status?
Yeah. Thank you. I have to go back in the memory banks here. So under Spanish civil law, Mexican women did have a lot more power than, if we could compare them to U.S. English common law of women, which they don't have that, right? They have the coverture, separate. It's a much harsher system for women under the English common law than under Spanish civil law. Yes, women could bring cases against, and most of my book covers cases where women are bringing cases against their husbands, against their partners or their lovers, or their out of wedlock with men, or against their fathers who are forcing them to marry somebody they don't want to marry. So certainly women could do these things, and they would bring in their husbands occasionally, depending if they were involved or not. But women had this, under Spanish civil law, women had the right to own their own property, to transfer it to their children. So it was a different system for women under civil law, Spanish civil law.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like even though that was in the early 1800s, things went backwards quite a bit for women.
Well, that's the thing. What happens when California becomes statehood, there's an argument about community property. And that's actually why we have community property, because under the they decide to, there's quite a bit of debates going on how much power to give married women in California after 1850. So it had to do with property and status, and yeah, it gets complicated. So
yeah. All right, so we have a question here that says, with the mission being secularized at the time, do you know how it was determined who lived at the mission and who didn't?
Well, so the missions were right in the 18th. There was the secularization order, I think, was 1813, right? But they didn't really start secularizing them in the 1830s, and essentially that meant that turning the missions into parishes, and the property that was being held and right was supposed to be held for Native peoples who were there. Essentially, I don't know how much of it, but much of it did get doled out to the people who had applied for ranchos, for land. So they were able to, that land was not given to, and we know that very few Native peoples received any of that land. In the research that I did looking at the Spanish land grants, I found like, I want to say like a handful, 5. I mean, very few people got property, like actual, somebody got, and in a couple of cases, a group of Native peoples came together as a ejido, right, as a community to ask for, I think it was in San Juan Capistrano where they asked for that. So very few ended up, and because you had to meet certain kinds of qualifications to gain that land, they felt that they were the Native people, the Neofitos, right, the Christians, that they were not prepared to take this land. And simply many of them just fled the area. There was many things that happened, right? Many of the Native peoples just, who were in the missions, just fled the area. Some of them went to, like as I mentioned, to Los Angeles to try to find work, or they went to the ranchos, or they went east to the east areas to live a life of freedom. So lots of different things happened at that time, or they formed, certainly there was pan-Indian, people just were with other different groups that weren't perhaps where they had come from originally or their ancestors, but they formed new groups. So there was lots of different things that happened at the time.
Wonderful. So there's a question here that says, how did natives acquire Spanish last names?
You don't see, you kind of see, in this case, she didn't have one, that was clear. How do they acquire them? Sometimes I didn't see it directly, even though it just kind of pops up in the records. I would think it has to do with the person, with the priest who they're with, perhaps, or who's employing them as a laborer. Children who are so quote unquote baptized into a family is because they're being brought from the outside, and they're becoming a servant. Sometimes they would take on the name of their masters or their employers, however you want to characterize them. But sometimes they do have what we would call last names, right? When they use 2 names and it's very much an indigenous name. You can see these in the mission records. I can't pronounce them right now, I don't remember them, but I remember seeing what we would consider to be 2 names. So that's, but that's a good question.
Yeah. It looks like we have one final question here that says, were the prosecutors and the defense lawyers public employees? Were they part of the municipal government, and how were they chosen?
No, that's a good question. I wonder if they were paid. I don't know if they were paid, but the people who, it's kind of the same figures you see around who would play all these roles, right? And essentially they were like propertied, wealthy, well, what they considered the wealthy, the elite of the community. They weren't always literate to some degree. They didn't have the best handwriting, I don't know if you noticed in that, it's very cryptic writing, but it didn't matter. They had a scribe who would do that. They did have to sign, but usually it was like Ignacio Coronel, Vicente Sanchez, Manuel Dominguez, these are people who own ranchos. So it was the elite in general. Let's see, how were they chosen? So they just kind of rotated the positions. So it's, same figures.
Okay. Well, perfect. Well, I think we are right at time. So first, I would love to thank you for this evening and spending your time with us to share this wonderful story. It's not a wonderful story, but it's a story that we're enjoying hearing. Let me clarify that. But thank you for that and sharing that with us. And then I also would love to thank all of our attendees for joining us tonight. And we hope you join us for the next 2 sessions coming up.
Wonderful. And I just want to say lastly,
yes,
if anybody has questions or they want to email me, I'd love to take questions over email or talk more. So I'm open to
we'll be happy to share your information.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.